Hi, boys and girls. I hope you've had a great time this past few weeks exploring the contemplative stream with Ignatius of Loyola. I sure have.
Yippee!
Now, let's take a few minutes and review what we've done in our learning communities and on our own. In our first week, we learned about Ignatius and about his spiritual exercises, and more specifically, about the principle and foundation that we are here to worship God, that the things of our lives can help or hinder that purpose, and that when we align our desires with God's, we discover the best possible life. The spiritual exercises are a tool to help us do just that. Now, as I mentioned in the introductory video, Ignatius's exercises are designed with a particular structure in mind. I did not tell you that structure at the time, but you have now discovered it in the month following. You see, in your second week of learning community, you were introduced to the first week of the spiritual exercises. Yes, by now, I'm sure you figured out that Ignatius ordered the exercises around a series of what he calls 4 weeks, which unfortunately we explored in weeks 2 through 5 of the InnerCHANGE Learning Community. So anyway, in the first week of the exercises, you are led into a discovery of your own sin, of the encumbrances that get in the way of your authentic following of Christ. We ask that God might give us a sense of grief for our sinful habits of life and thought. Now, the second week of the exercises, which we actually covered in the third week of the learning community, introduces us to the life of Christ. We spent time remembering the birth and the life of Jesus, imagining the gospel stories just as if we were there with him. We asked that God might grant us a desire to imitate Christ in our own lives. And it was in this week that we began to look at the InnerCHANGE commitment to purity and to long for a desire to be pure just like Christ in all of our relationships. Now, the third week of the exercises brought us to the Passion of Christ. We witnessed those last hours and we grieved the death of our Lord. We also explored Ignatius's rules for food and drink. Then, finally, we looked at the resurrection of Christ and the final week of the spiritual exercises, rejoicing in the resurrection appearances of Christ just as if we had been there. In the process of following Ignatius and the exercises through the weeks, you have been introduced to a number of different devotional practices. Okay, learning community facilitators, this is your cue to hand out the list of activities and experiences, okay? You've just now received a pretty comprehensive list of practices and such which are often associated with the spiritual exercises. Now, obviously, you won't be able to do all of these, but you might like to play with some of them. Let me review 3 of them here. First, there is the idea of reviewing our life, sometimes called self-examination. Now, there are many ways of doing self-examination, and that is what I want to clarify here. You see, it's easy for us to think of self-examination as some kind of looking back on our day or looking back on our week or life even, and confessing all of the sins that come to mind. But hey, self-examination is exactly what you were doing when you did your God Hunt exercise. You examine your experience from the day, you notice the presence or ministry of God, and then you respond. You see, it's all self-examination. examination. Now, another practice that you learned about in the past few weeks is colloquy. I just love the sound of this word, colloquy. Colloquy. The word is fresh, but the meaning, frankly, is pretty basic to all we understand about our faith. A colloquy is an intimate conversation with the Lord, friend to friend, servant to master. There is no set pattern, it's a way of doing it that's right or wrong. You see, you speak with the Lord when you have something to say, and then you remain silent the rest of the time, perhaps, so he can speak with you. Ignatius would say that the colloquy is, quote, now asking some grace, now blaming oneself for some misdeed, now communicating one's affairs, asking advice in them. Can't we learn just to be open and honest with God in prayer to our Lord and our best friend? Now, a third practice that we learned was the art of biblical meditation. You followed the steps again and again as you entered into the passage for each day of the week. But let me review them again for you here. First, there are the preludes. We name the passage or story of our meditation. We briefly picture the place of that story in our mind. We ask for what we want, that the Spirit of God might move in our hearts in a way that is appropriate to the passage. We read the passage, and then we meditate. And that meditation then leads us from the preludes to the points. We imagine the story from different perspectives. We imagine it from the point of view of different characters in the story. And we engage all our being in the story, mind, will, feelings, and perhaps even our body. Then we move from the preludes and the points to the prayer. We close our time of biblical meditation with a colloquy, talking to God about our impressions, questions, or inclinations as we interacted with the passage. Bible meditation is really a very simple practice, but life-changing. Let me close then by saying a few words about the spiritual exercises and discernment. I mentioned in the first video about Ignatius' life that it all started as Ignatius noticed different effects inside himself when he would either imagine acts of chivalry or acts of charity. Ignatius, in his autobiographical comments on this event, wrote, and he speaks of himself in the third person, this was his first reflection on the things of God. And later, when he composed the exercises, this was his starting point in clarifying the matter of the diversity of spirits. How do we know what spirit is influencing our thoughts or feelings? The art of discerning spirits is a primary concern of Ignatius in the exercises. How do we distinguish the will of God in our lives from all our disordered desires? The exercises are structured to help us succeed at this very discernment. Week 1 helps us identify those encumbrances that hinder us from noticing or acknowledging God's leading. Week 2 cultivates a desire to imitate Christ with our own life. And ideally, by the end of week 2, we get a sense of what that imitation might look like in the real here and now of our lives. In week 3, we count the cost of following Christ. We imagine what following through with our sense of Christ-like living might involve. And then finally, in week 4, we see the fruit of discernment in the resurrected life, finding Christ in all things. The exercises are a framework for personal discernment. So that's about it. You've already received a list of Ignatian exercises and activities. We will also be making available a list of books, online resources, and other stuff. We encourage you to explore. Well, no. We encourage you to play. Play with this stuff. See what might be helpful as you step forward into this. Remember, the Jesuits were urban missionaries among the poor of Rome and elsewhere long before anyone even thought of interchange. And these practices were essential for the Jesuit way of life. You could do worse, right? If you're interested in doing the full exercises, perhaps in an interchange cohort, just contact Deanna or Mariah, and they will get you in touch with me. We'll just see what works out. Okay? In the meantime, I hope you have a great day.